A new year, a new series of airshow dispatches, and we start at the Australian International Airshow at Avalon. But first, here's a look at what's coming up over the next 8 months. This year, airshow dispatches will take you to more than 10 airshows in 7 nations for our most ambitious series yet. Among the highlights, the Italian Air Force's 100th anniversary. We'll take you to 2 airshows in Poland this year, the magical Antidotum Airshow, followed by one of the biggest military shows of 2023 at Squadron. And there's a stop in France for Paris Air Legend. In the UK, we'll make our 5th consecutive visit to the Midlands Air Festival, but we'll also break new ground with an episode from the first edition of Wings and Things to be held since 2006. It's not all about Europe. We'll go to Lima in Malaysia and take in the big 3 American aerobatic teams at the California International Airshow and Fleet Week. This is Airshow Dispatches. Welcome to a new series of Airshow Dispatches, and welcome to Australia, as we start our season with the largest Southern Hemisphere airshow of 2023. So, let's begin by taking a quick look at the lineup and running order. We'll start with the American contingent, followed by the other foreign military performances, the Japanese C-2 and the Black Eagles. Then the Warbirds and civilian displays. Back to the military for the home team, including the ADF Showcase, which includes a very broad range of military assets. And we wrap things up with the night show. Nigel Woolley behind the camera for our first couple of episodes this year. He was filming across all 6 show days, but let's get straight to it with the F-22A Raptor. Starting with a minimum radius turn. And completing this manoeuvre in 21 seconds. That gives the aircraft a sustained turn rate of some 17 degrees per second, which is about typical for 4th and 5th generation fighters at airshows, but we'll see how some of the others compare later on. The F-22 is about to perform the J-turn, an abrupt pull akin to a cobra, putting the aircraft into a stall, and then during that stall period pivoting around the left wingtip. Potentially a very useful manoeuvre in combat, bleeding off a lot of energy in the first instance, but also reversing direction about 30% faster than normal. The F-22 is a true stealth fighter with a radar cross-section about the size of a marble, and that is maintained even during operational combat sorties through the aircraft's internal weapons bays, which we're about to see on the next pass. The main bay can accommodate 4 BVR air-to-air missiles, with 2 additional short-range air-to-air missiles housed in secondary bays. Of course, opening those doors removes the Raptor's stealth advantage, which is why the whole process of firing a missile takes only 1 second. A classic F-22 manoeuvre now, the pedal turn, maintaining around 60 degrees of alpha, and using full rudder and full aileron to create a continuous yawing motion. manoeuvre made possible by a combination of the F-22's large control surfaces, advanced flight control software, and of course, its 2D vectored thrust. The Raptor can vector its thrust up to plus or minus 20 degrees from the midpoint on the vertical plane. This is done by adapting the shape of the thrust buckets to deflect the jet efflux. The primary benefit of doing so is that it can increase the aircraft's pitch rate by up to 50%, and we're about to see that demonstrated very effectively in the power loop. The trade-off is that the faster your pitch rate and the more alpha you employ, the more energy the aircraft bleeds. So now, a very low speed exiting the power loop, and momentarily quite a fast sink rate. Loaded roll at 36 degrees of alpha. And a controversial one coming up next. The F-22 demo team call this a Cobra. And they can call it that, but it isn't one. An abrupt high alpha pull to the vertical, and then a push back to level flight. Very impressive manoeuvrability, but the Cobra does have an internationally recognised definition, and that is not it. A masterfully flown display by Major Josh Gunderson. This being his final airshow appearance, he will hand over to a new display pilot before the start of the Northern Hemisphere airshow season later this year. Next up, another American asset with a pair of flypasts. It's a B52 Strato Fortress from the 20th Bomb Squadron at Barksdale in Louisiana. And we're getting a very good demonstration there of one of the B-52's most famous characteristics, those trademark smoke trails from its 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33s, a family of engines that date back to the 1950s. They're almost as old as the B-52 itself. During the airshow, Rolls-Royce announced that they had begun testing on its successor, the F-130, which should start appearing on B-52s in 2028. And now our final US military participant, the Pacific Air Force's C-17 demonstration team from the 535th Airlift Squadron at Hickam in Hawaii. Demonstrating an aircraft that Australia has in service as well. The RAAF has 8 Globemasters on strength. Capable of carrying some 77 tons of cargo, which is a little over double the payload capacity of the aircraft we're about to see next, the Kawasaki C2. Here is the C2. First flying in 2010, it was developed for the Japanese military because it was deemed no foreign design met the Japanese requirements. Those requirements included the ability to operate from short strips of just 500 metres, the ability to carry a 26-ton payload, and a sufficiently high cruising speed to fly on commercial air routes, a characteristic that the C-17 doesn't have. The design was based on the earlier Kawasaki C1, but various improvements have increased its payload fourfold. The aircraft is now replacing the C1 and the C-130 in Japanese service, and a signals intelligence version will soon replace the YS-11 also. The type is now being marketed to potential export customers, particularly to several nations in the Middle East. Speaking of marketing aircraft to export customers, time now for the Black Eagles. They're here to sell the idea of Australia purchasing the Korea Aerospace Industries T-50. It's one of 3 aircraft vying to replace the RAAF's fleet of 33 Hawk 127s, which are due for retirement in around 10 years from now. The other competitors are the Leonardo M346 Master and the Boeing T-7 Red Hawk. It's no stranger to export success, this aircraft. Its light combat variant recently won a landmark order from Poland, being selected ahead of the F-16V, and just in the last few weeks it has been selected by Malaysia, where it was up against the Hindustan Aeronautics Tejas in their LCA competition. Outstanding formation changes here. I don't know of any other team that performs quite such dramatic changes of formation during aerobatic manoeuvres. Here are some more. No fewer than 4 different formations exhibited during this 360-degree turn. Starting in diamond formation, then spreading out into their widest shape, albatross. The wider the shape, the harder it is to hold accurately, so that's pretty exceptional. Now collapsing into eagle formation, a shape depicting the T-50. And as the jets come by, watch for the eagle to spread its wings. They were the winners of the Best Overall Display Award here at Avalon, Black Eagles, which you will probably be unsurprised to learn. If they can do it both times of asking at Air Tattoo, then they can most certainly do it here, where the pool of competitors is so much smaller. This was the team's first visit to Australia, first time in the Southern Hemisphere in fact, And it comes off the back of last year's World Tour, which saw them display in the UK, Poland, Egypt and the Philippines. They would have gone to Latvia and Slovakia too, had it not been for the security situation in Eastern Europe. Watch now for probably their most famous manoeuvre, the rainfall break. This is two-ship High Alpha and Loop. The aircraft trailing red smoke, going to pass twice through this formation. While it is a brilliant display sequence, probably one of the best on the airshow circuit globally, Black Eagles don't have quite the same level of finesse as some of the other big national aerobatic teams, and that is evident here more so than usual. They had their busiest ever season last year, inducted some new pilots over the winter, and then had a very short training period because Avalon falls about 2 months earlier in the year than their first show is typically held. This loop, for example, is supposed to be in a line abreast formation symbolising the number 1 and the Black Eagles' desire to become the world's top aerobatic team. As you can see, it's not quite working out on this occasion. It's a shame because on their day they really are the best of the best. With a lovely mix of manoeuvres, as you can see. Definitely some Red Arrows influence, definitely some Thunderbirds influence, a little bit of Patrouille de France creeping in there also, but they do very much have their own identity. An ever-increasing number of their manoeuvres are world unique, and even the familiar ones have a Black Eagles accent to them. This, for example, is very definitely a Black Eagles manoeuvre. They call it the snake rolls. And here's another that they've invented. It's their landing break to end the show, putting all 8 aircraft straight into the landing pattern. Most teams would do some kind of tactical pitch breakout, but here's how the Black Eagles achieve the same result. Absolutely amazing. More formation teams now, but this time of a civilian nature. Here is reigning Red Bull Air Race World Champion Matt Hall flying the MXSR he used to compete in. He's accompanied for the first time by Emma McDonald in the team's Extra 300L. She's the operations manager for Matt Hall Racing and actually tried out as an air racer herself in 2021, shortly before the sport collapsed. This is her public airshow debut. Inverted pass coming up. Fabulous rollout. Perfect synchronicity. And now another Australian formation team, this time one that we have seen on many occasions before. It is the ubiquitous Sky Aces from the Paul Bennett Airshows collection. They're flying a mix of 4 variants of the Pitts S1, a design that dates back to the mid-1940s, but it has been kept relevant through many upgrades and improvements over the years, branching out into a great number of sub-variants, as you can see here. Many of those are still available to buy as self-assembly kits today. There's another act we've seen before, sort of. It's British aerobatic pilot and leader of the Global Stars aerobatic team Mark Jeffries, but on this occasion flying well away from his home turf in a loaned extra NG from the Perth-based company Awesome Aviation. The extra NG is the latest in Walter Extra's very long line of world-beating aerobatic machines. It was unveiled in 2019. With its well-appointed and comfortable cockpit, the NG is more in the mould of the Extra 330 LX than the competition-dominating 330 SC, and it's yet to see much use at the sharp end of big international aerobatic competitions. Nonetheless, it handles extremely well, as you can see, with various aerodynamic improvements as compared to its predecessor, and a newer generation of engine as well. Mark actually trained for this routine on his Extra 330 SC and says the manoeuvres transferred over pretty much perfectly. Diving in now for the first of his 2 appearances in the programme is Jakob Hollander, flying his catwalk routine. So called as there's a wing walker in a cat suit affixed to each of the wings, streaming copious amounts of smoke from the wingtips. A typical airshow aircraft might carry you perhaps 6 or 8 wingtip smoke canisters, but this one can carry more than 50. This is pyrotechnic smoke, the same sort of thing a parachutist might wear on their feet, with each canister being ignited using electronic detonators. That system will come in very handy for another purpose, which we will see at the end of the programme. Bit of Warbird action now, courtesy of 100 Squadron, which is the heritage unit of the Royal Australian Air Force. In this segment we see their trainer fleet, with the 1930s and 40s being represented first of all. A Tiger Moth in the lead, and behind that a Ryan ST. It was designed as a trainer for the US military and was also used by the Dutch. The Australians ended up with 34 second-hand ex-Dutch examples in 1942 and used them up until the end of the Second World War. This next formation represents the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. It features a ubiquitous Harvard, but also a rather less common Windshield designed in Australia in the mid-1950s. and in the lead a product of New Zealand, the CT-4 Air Trainer, which first flew in 1972 and continued to be operated in military service until just 3 years ago. A few passes next from the fighters. A Spitfire with the CA-18, the Australian licence-built version of the P-51D Mustang. The Mark 23 was the best and most numerous version of the CA-18. And the only one to be equipped with a Rolls-Royce Merlin rather than an Allison V1710. Our final 100 Squadron contribution is their English electric Canberra, currently the only Canberra flying in civilian hands globally, although there are 3 airworthy WB-57s currently serving with NASA. This particular example is an ex-Royal Air Force target tug. It came under the ownership of the Temora Aviation Museum but was grounded in 2010 because the method of starting the engines, which relied on a single-use starter cartridge, became unsustainable. The museum began a lengthy process of modifying those engines such that they can now be started with an electronic motor, and the jet returned to the air in 2021. There's an Avalon link worth mentioning here because the Canberras that flew for the Royal Australian Air Force were constructed at this very airfield. In RAAF service, they were used mainly for reconnaissance and low-level bombing, and the type saw action in Malaysia and Vietnam. Onto the modern-day Australian military for our next few segments. And here we see a duo of Super Hornets accompanying an A330-200 from national airline Qantas. A330 in this case is wearing special pride colours. The airline has 28 A330s, 18 of which are the smaller Dash 200 variant. Qantas is due to begin the search for a replacement in the next year or two. The A350 is probably the front runner there. Qantas has already placed an order for A350s as part of Project Sunrise, aiming to start non-stop flights from Sydney to London in around 2025. It's pretty much an all-Airbus airline nowadays, with their 737 fleet shortly to retire. From Qantas to the Roulettes, one Australian aviation icon to another. Running in now for a 6-ship opposition break, the Roulettes are currently the only aerobatic team in the world to perform this manoeuvre with quite so many aircraft. The Snowbirds and the Saudi Hawks do it with 5, but that's the closest equivalent. Now 2 pairs of rollbacks. Trailing that very photogenic smoke from the underwing pods throughout, that currently being the only form of smoke system certified for use on the PC-21. Of course, for the previous generation of Pilatus aircraft, we're used to seeing exhaust smoke, not quite centerline smoke because of the position of the engine exhaust on the side of the nose. This new system is symmetrical and a much more eye-catching sight. The PC-21 sports an uprated version of the Pratt & Whitney PT6, producing 1,600 shaft horsepower. That's about 40% more than the PC-9. It makes an awful lot more noise as well, and that massive engine makes the PC-21 the fastest single-engine turboprop in the world, or at the very least the fastest to ever enter mass production. One final break to end the show. And now the ADF Showcase, in which we are briefly presented with a very broad range of Australian Defence Force assets. First to fly past, the E-7A Wedgetail. Australia was the first operator of this aircraft type. It was delivered in 2009 and made its operational debut in 2014 during the search for MH370. Australia currently has 6 of them on strength. Turkey, South Korea and the UK have since become customers, and the USA has formally ordered the type just in the last few days, with entry into service due in 2027. Now a pass by a KC-30A multi-role tanker transport, flanked by 2 Super Hornets. The first one was delivered to Australia in 2011, and the RAAF has 7 on strength. And now one of Australia's 12 P-8A Poseidons. The total fleet size will eventually be 14 aircraft, fully replacing the AP-3C Orion. Indeed, we saw one of those recently retired Orions flying in civilian hands in Airshow Dispatch's Series 5 Episode 9 from Wings over Illawarra 2022. A good look there at the P-8's internal weapons bay with 5 weapons stations. There are a further 6 external hardpoints, and you can see 2 of those in use at the moment. They can carry cruise missiles, over-the-horizon anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, mines and depth charges. Behind the main weapons bay, you might also have seen a number of small circular holes through which sonar buoys can be deployed. Another maritime patrol asset flies through now, the MH-60R Seahawk Romeo. Finally, the turn of the fighters. 2 F-35s from number 3 Squadron and 2 Super Hornets from number 1 Squadron. Super Hornets then commence a short airfield attack scenario. Now, solo displays by several of the assets we've just witnessed. Starting with the MH-60R Seahawk Romeo of the Royal Australian Navy. It's one of 24 Seahawks delivered to Australia in the mid-2010s. It was announced at the end of last year that Australia had ordered a further 12 MH-60Rs to replace the Navy's fleet of relatively young MRH-90 Taipans, with deliveries due to begin in 2025. The MRH-90 is the Australian designation for the very controversial NH-90 NATO frigate helicopter, which has been a bit of a thorn in the Australian Navy's side ever since it missed its target delivery date in 2008. Ever since then, the type has been plagued with serious technical problems, poor reliability, and a lack of spare parts, and Australia is among at least 3 nations to be pulling the type from service many years earlier than expected. The irony is that although the NH-90 remains a costly platform to operate, most of the problems it has experienced have now been ironed out. But the Seahawk will nonetheless be the proven and cost-effective replacement not just for the Australian Navy's NH-90s, but for the Australian Army's NH-90 fleet as well. But now a change of pace as the sun begins to set, with a very high quality fastjet solo display indeed from an RAAF F-18F Super Hornet. Australia operates 24 Super Hornets bought to bridge the gap between the F-111 Aardvark and the F-35A Lightning II, which we'll see in a moment. First delivered in 2009, they are all based with number 1 Squadron at RAAF Base Amberley, and they will continue to serve until at least 2030, at which point they will likely be replaced by a fresh order of F-35s. Now, a very famous Hornet manoeuvre, often known as the hat, an abrupt pull to the vertical, followed by a push back to level flight. The whole push-pull sequence taking place just 3 seconds slower than the F-22 we saw earlier, which proves just how exceptional the pitch authority is in the Super Hornet. It's long been the benchmark in that regard among non-thrust vectoring aircraft. now in for a minimum radius turn. It's limited to 7.5 G, which is considerably less than the 9G standard for most modern jets, but the aircraft makes up for that with a large wing area accentuated by those strakes or leading edge root extensions, which generate about 30% of the aircraft's total lift. They also generate vortices over the wing that help the wing to keep generating lift, even at very high angles of attack. "21 seconds to complete that turn. Absolutely identical to the Raptor we saw earlier, and we'll see in a moment how the F-35 compares to that. Here is the F-35, launching into a minimum radius turn of its own. A type that was accepted into Australian service in 2018. There's now more than 50 of them on strength, and it will be the RAAF's primary fighter aircraft for many years to come. Aileron rolls coming up next, and look out for the very distinctive vortices as the aircraft is rolling. One set of vortices will come from the wingtip itself, but the other comes from the protruding corner of the flaperons, which give an interesting dual vortex visual effect. We saw something similar at times from the F-22 earlier on in the programme. Now the F-35's version of a weapons bay pass. The F-35 has 4 internal weapons stations, compared to 8 on the F-22. Most of the manoeuvres that the Australian F-35 display includes are very similar to those flown by their more famous counterparts from the US Air Force, apart perhaps from some of these negative G bunts and loaded rolls. But there is one manoeuvre that's fairly unique to the Australian fastjet solo displays, and that is a dirty wing rock. Now a minimum radius turn, probably maintaining about 5G. The F-35 is a 9G capable fighter, as most are nowadays, but in a sustained turn like this, there's always a balance to be struck between the load factor, which ideally you want to be set as high as possible, but also the need to maintain airspeed. Clocking in at 20 seconds, so around a second faster than the others. The Friday of the Australian International Airshow, day 4 of 6, traditionally concludes with a night show, and that relies predominantly on civilian performers. This is Bob Carlton of Vertigo Airshows in his Super Salto glider, but being a rocket engineer, he's decided to fit it with a jet engine and a system for firing pyrotechnics, as you can see. These night shows are an opportunity to use aircraft to create stunning visual effects rather than to show off the aeroplanes directly. So if you want to see more of this aircraft and what it can do, then do take a look at Airshow Dispatches Series 5 Episode 8 from the Aerospace Valley Airshow 2022 at Edwards AFB, California. And in that film you can see its daytime aerobatic routine. The Super Salto hails from Germany, one of the leading nations in glider design, and the name Salto is the German word for loop, reflecting the aircraft's aerobatic credentials. It was developed from a much more conventional glider, but modified with, among other things, a reduced wingspan for better roll rate, a V-tail and trailing edge air brakes rather than centrally located ones for reduced drag. The result is a fairly modest glide ratio of 34:1, modest at least compared to other gliders, but that hardly matters when you've got a PBS TJ100 jet turbine on board. And now something of a record breaker. This is Jakob Hollander of Scandinavian Airshows flying his Catwalk LLP display. That stands for Laser Lights and Pyro. The aircraft is a Grumman AgCat. It's got a 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R985 engine, a lot of payload available, a chunky low aspect ratio wing, sturdy fixed landing gear, and all that means there's a lot of options for fitting this aircraft with extra attachments. The attachments in question are of a pyrotechnic nature, as you can see. If you ever get a chance to see this aeroplane on the ground, the metal pyro rigs fixed to the wingtips and wheel spats are quite a sight to behold, and they carry a greater amount of pyrotechnics than any other airshow aircraft in the world. There's just one more aircraft to go in our flying display. A single pass from an RAAF C-130J in to dump some flares. And that's it from the Australian International Airshow 2023. Do join us next time from the Langkawi International Maritime and Aerospace Exhibition in Malaysia. That episode will be along at the start of June. Until then, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye for now.